Chief Jennifer Tejada has been working in municipal law enforcement for over 24 years. Over that time, she has worked in a leadership capacity in several specialized areas, including community policing, juvenile justice reform, threat management, emergency and disaster preparedness, workplace violence prevention, domestic violence and sexual assault prevention, as well as hostage negotiation. Chief Tejada served on the California Police Chiefs Association as the chair of the Law and Legislative Committee for almost 5 years, and in that capacity, she influenced and supported legislation that introduced reforms in training and service delivery standards in California policing. Chief Tejada has been tirelessly advocating for the inclusion of resiliency training in officer wellness programs and criminal justice reform measures. She is a certified mindfulness coach for first responders and serves as the chair for the Wellness and Resiliency Committee for the California Police Chiefs Association. She speaks regularly at local, regional, and national levels, advocating for training that provides the skills and tools first responders need to successfully navigate through the stress and trauma of our professions. Please welcome Jennifer.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me here today. This is a great honor to speak at such a magnificent event, an event that's so well attended, and one that's being broadcast live across Canada and the US, which speaks volumes, I think, to the reason that we are here. And so just a little bit about me before I got into law enforcement that I think will give you a sense of why I have passion around this topic of suicide awareness and prevention. I'm originally from Ireland, and so sometimes when I speak in the States, I have this meshing of accents and people say, "Are you from Canada?" So I'm home. But I am from Ireland. I grew up there. My family is all back there. And when I was ready to get married, I chose to go back to Ireland and have my wedding there. And so every time that I went back to Ireland to visit, there was always great celebration at my house. My parents put a big yellow ribbon up outside to let the town know, oh, she's coming home, and it was always great excitement. So as I drove down from Dublin Airport to my hometown, which is about an hour and a half away, I don't think the tires of the car hit the road. I was going so fast, so excited to get home. It's 3 days before our wedding. I have my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, my soon-to-be, in the back of the car, my soon-to-be husband in the passenger seat. I had to drive because I knew if one of those 3 people drove, we would take forever to get home. So racing down from Dublin to my hometown, New Ross, and we get into town, and I am so excited to be home. And we drive up the hill to my house, and I see lots of cars. Now, I know I'm popular, but I'm not that popular. Lots of cars, lots of people milling about, coming in and out of the house. And as we get closer, I see my mother in the doorway. And we get closer, and I pull up, and I see her face. And I feel like I've been gut punched. I know that look. And I jump out of the car, and I'm thinking, my dad, my dad, my dad. And then I see him behind her. And then I'm like, what's wrong? And I run up, and she said, Paul's dead. This is 3 days before my wedding. I have my in-laws, my soon-to-be in-laws, my soon-to-be husband, guests from the US coming. What happened? He hung himself this morning. So I have intimate experience on the suddenness of this, of death by suicide. I have intimate experience on the impact it has on the brothers, the sisters, the parents, and in my brother's case, his wife and his 3 little children. And I have intimate knowledge on the questions, the unanswered questions that remain. It took years for me to understand what happened, to understand my response, to understand my family's response. And then another chapter in this story was 4 months later. My father did pass away because he could not get over the fact that at the same time my brother hung himself in the stables at the back of our yard, he was in the bottom of the yard, turning his car on, warming it up for the day. And he never forgave himself. So 4 months later, I returned to Ireland for his funeral. And then around that issue of suicide, you have, oh my gosh, can we take him to the church? Catholic Ireland wasn't so accepting that people who died by suicide were fit to be brought to the church. So we had that issue. What kind of prayers can we say? Can we have a proper funeral? But all these things to navigate through at this time of trauma and sadness and grief. And there's so many layers to suicide. And I guess my passion is that I know we can bring suicide out of the shadows. We can disarm it of the shame that it's shrouded in. We can truly help people who are in need of help. And suicide ideology is not a death sentence. And that's the other part of my story. So let's take a look at policing today and ask ourselves, why are we here? Why are first responders the focus of this topic of suicide awareness and prevention? And in my county on Monday, we lost another officer to suicide. Young officer, 30 years old, went to a park and shot himself with his shotgun. He leaves behind a pregnant wife, 30 years old, Army veteran from 2000. Why? And I have a theory about why, at least part of the why. If I can figure out how to work the clicker. Okay, here we go. So in policing today, we have a lot of narrative around excessive force. We have a lot of narrative and negative fallout around officer-involved shootings. And our officers in California, and I'm sure it's the same across the United States and Canada, we are dealing more and more with issues of mental health crises in their communities, drug-induced mental health crises, and our officers are called upon to deal with this myriad of social issues that our training can't possibly prepare them to do it effectively. We're just scratching the surface when we respond to these incidents, yet society expects us to handle all of this, particularly in communities where other resources for social services are scarce. And because of all the narrative around officer-involved shootings, and particularly those ones where we didn't do a good job, we have lost, to a great degree, community trust. And so when you come to work every day, you know, you hope that the people you come to work with and for want you there. But in policing today, a lot of communities, a lot of organizations are in communities where the message is, we don't want you. And we're dealing with issues like implicit bias and structural racism. I mean, we do need reform. There's no doubt about that. But we're putting all of this responsibility and all of this negativity on the shoulders of our first responders. And I speak particularly about law enforcement, but I have no illusion about the fact that, you know, firefighters, paramedics, emergency room staff, there are lots of professions where there's an enormous amount of responsibility to serve others and little focus on serving self. And I put on here the release of records. We have a new law in California where we're now releasing a lot of our personnel records. And this was particularly a poignant moment for me in my department when we recently released the records of an officer-involved shooting where we did kill an African-American woman. And the officers, I didn't realize this when we were preparing the records. Releasing those records meant that the interviews of those officers about this incident, in which they were fragile, vulnerable, sometimes crying, fearful, all of their vulnerability is exposed in those interviews. So in essence, we are re-traumatizing them and creating more stress for them in this release of records. So it to me, it just provided another opportunity to reflect on how are we serving our people. Some of the common responses to what we're doing wrong and why we're doing it is, let's give them more training. Let's teach them some more de-escalation tactics. Let's send them to crisis intervention training. Let's get more community involvement. Let's create more legislation about what they can and cannot do. And let's have more policies, because all of those things seem to be the answer to police reform. But when I look at that list, I think, really, all of that together will not have the change that we want and that our communities expect, because there's a missing element. You can throw all the training in the world at officers. You can create all the legislation that you want. But if we don't take care of the human behind the badge and create value and pride in that person, we will not be as effective as we want to be with any other reform. It's all about performance and how performance is connected to resiliency, emotional well-being, and a sense of value in ourselves. We face enormous pressure to perform in this profession and to prove ourselves. And as a female in a male-dominated profession, I can tell you that the pressure to perform and prove myself was double that or maybe triple that of my male counterparts. And I'll thank them, because I couldn't have done it without them. We don't teach in policing today how to calm down the body. We don't teach emotional regulation. It's not even part of the conscious consideration of officers or trainers. It's just not included in much of our training. It's very unusual if that is. We're trained to believe that being hypervigilant at all times is how we survive. That's how to perform, to be hypervigilant at all times. Is there somebody coming behind me? Those doors closed, that one's open, somebody could run in there. Always hypervigilance, always watching, scanning the environment for the next threat. That's how they train us. And on top of that, an officer's day, and even a dispatcher too, is full of stressful events, responding to people in crisis, responding to victims who are maybe screaming or angry, responding to traumatic events, collisions where there's fatalities, child abuse cases. And we fail to take care of our people who are extending this enormous service to the communities they serve. And we have this denial of ownership of their humanity. One of the previous speakers talked about shared humanity. Awareness of our shared humanity is one, I think, of the most powerful things that will connect us together and help us communicate, particularly with our communities. And when we deny our officers and our firefighters that awareness of their humanity and embracing humanity, we're taking something very important away from them that will help them be successful in their jobs. We deny them an emotional response. I remember my first day in the academy and having to stand at attention and not move, and you have somebody yelling in your face, and in this case he was a smoker, and I was thinking, oh my God, he smokes, but I couldn't. And then about 6 months ago on Twitter, I saw a feed from an agency in the Midwest, and this really illustrates the foundation that we set in our officers and our first responders, particularly law enforcement, the foundation that we set for them to deny themselves an appropriate emotional response. There was a line of recruits, and the tax sergeant was standing with a rubber duck, and he was going down the line with his rubber duck, and he went in front of each of their faces, and when he squeezed the duck, it said, "Quack, wake up, it's not the afternoon, it's just the morning." The duck went quack. So he went around, quack, 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 quack. And if a recruit smiled or laughed, that recruit and everybody else had to do push-ups. So his success rate, depending on how you look at it, was pretty high because most of the recruits ended up doing push-ups. The message he was sending was what? If you have an appropriate emotional response to an event, you will be punished. First week in the academy, and it just builds on that. And when we continually stuff emotions, what happens? And so we have the foundation of what I call crafting a suit of cultural armor. Our police culture is pretty good at reinforcing this denial of emotional response, this stoicism. And I will say that that's important to have. You can't go to a call where there's a murder or a heinous crime and have a smile on your face. You have to regulate how you present yourself to people when you're responding to somebody who needs help. But the problem is that when we teach this denial of emotional response, appropriate emotional response, we're killing the person inside, that human behind the badge. We're denying them of their humanity. And think about somebody who's done that for 20, 30 years. So I think training today, it really ignores one of the reasons that I'm here today is there's a large body of scientific evidence that addresses trauma and resiliency and stress and the efficacy and the importance of including skill building around emotional regulation, around awareness of our physical response to stress and trauma. And our training largely ignores that. And when I reached a point of no return in my career, this is what saved me. It is my journey into mindfulness and compassion cultivation that spoke to the invisible injuries that I had. We're very good at responding to the visible injuries when some of our brothers or sisters get shot or hurt on the job and we can see it. We're all about responding to that. Or after a shooting, we do a debrief and we put them back together. But what we don't do is front load that. When we do a debrief after a major incident, we've already got somebody now, if they haven't had this training in mind-body connection and emotional regulation and skill building and resiliency, they're already broken. So my question is, why don't we front load it? Why don't we front load training with our first responders so that when there's a critical incident, they can journey through the trauma, they can journey through the stress, and not end up with this big sack of trauma and stress that's carried to work every day, everywhere. It's carried home. We take it home, and we bring it to our families. We need to front load our training so that our officers can mitigate stress, they can journey through the trauma and come out whole at the end and not broken and suicidal and with all the health issues that we see in this profession. And so I wanted to do a little bit because it's the science behind this that I think speaks to first responders. And because we're really tough, you know, we know it all. And when I want to get a first responder to really think and absorb what I'm saying, I present a little bit of the science on how we respond to stress. And we have this little thing in our brains called the amygdala, and that's where our flight or fight response comes from. And the amygdala sends a message to the hippocampus and says, this thing is bad, so in the future, stay away from it. There's constant messaging between these, and it's about our evolution. It's how we survived, right? It's this messaging. The amygdala goes, whoa, fight or flight. And the hippocampus says, okay, remember that, right? So as first responders then, when we go to an incident, the amygdala is fully engaged, and it's producing cortisol, and the cortisol helps us be alert, right, and aware. And so what we want to see is this. This is a healthy nervous system. When nothing is happening and we're just going about our day, we should be in the parasympathetic nervous system should be operating. And we should be sort of here, something happens, we get aroused, the amygdala is engaged. When we get aroused, we produce cortisol for survival, helps us be aware of the environments. And then when the event is over, we go back down into a zone of coherence, I call it. And so in moderate arousal of the sympathetic nervous system, we have optimal alertness, we have focused attention, we know what's going on, and most importantly for first responders, we have memory recall for our training. So we'll know what to do, we'll know how to respond. In severe arousal, and this is what happens, unfortunately, to most first responders, because we don't teach them how to come back down. I remember early on in my career, one day in particular, which I think is representative of what a lot of first responders go through. Whether you're riding in an ambulance, whether you're on a fire truck, whether you're in a police car, emergency room staff, whether you're working in the psych unit in a PD. So we get a call for service this day. It's a suicide. And so I pull up, and these two people come out, and he just shot himself in our garage. It was their neighbor, and he had come in and asked if he could borrow something in their garage, and they said, sure, go. What they didn't realize was he was going in there to shoot himself. So I walk in, and he's slumped up against the wall, and he'd taken a shotgun, blown his head off, his brain matter everywhere, and his eyes were like one of those Halloween masks, and the eyes were just looking right at me, and he was flat against the wall. It was horrible. So I took out my gunshot residue kit, did all of that, took the brain matter off the shotgun, did all of that, cleaned that up, tried to find relatives, try to console the elderly neighbors whose house he did it in, and all the time, I'm like this. I am hypervigilance. I am stucking on. So we get done with that scene, and L17 respond to collision. I forget the street. 6 juveniles involved. Code 3, go there. I get there. One of the juveniles' legs is wrapped up around his back. One is obviously dead at the wheel. And they're scattered all around. 6 kids in a car speeding, and a horrible scene. So I went from this suicide to this scene. Then, when all of that was done, I tried to get some report writing done, and I went to all the other little calls, the shoplifting, the family fight mediation, all of those things that come up. And then I try and write my report, and then I go home, and then I get up the next day and I do the same thing all over again. I never had a chance to stop and ask, am I okay? Nor did anybody else ask if I was okay. And that's my career. And I think although those 2 incidents were quite tragic and on the same day, and that's not every day, but it just illustrates that I suffered that day, and I didn't even know I was suffering. And had I shown any emotion around this, particularly with that suicide, I would have been shamed for it. I would have been an embarrassment to my department, because we're not supposed to cry. And I am Niagara Falls when it comes to crying. So this was really challenging for me in this career, to not cry and show emotion. And I'm an emotional person. So for me, it was a slow death every time, every day. And so this slide illustrates that when we spend every day and years in this state of hypervigilance, this is what happens. I don't know where yeah. And so you're stuck your cortisol is constantly being produced when you're in this state, by the way, which contributes to our unhealthy profiles. But anxiety, hyperactivity, inability to relax. Who knows somebody who has trouble relaxing in this profession? And then when we're in the stuck on off, it's the person who's, sad, depressed, low energy. And then there's the sleep. Sleep is elusive, I think, whichever side of the spectrum you're on. Sleep is very elusive, and I think it's one of the first signs in our profession that we're seeing some issues. And sleep is hugely important to our well-being. And so here we have no surprise that our profession has some of the worst health profiles of any profession, from shift work to disturbing crime scenes to the internal stress in an organization and the external stress and all of the things that come with that, the self-medicating that happens, the lack of sleep, just the sense of being devalued as a human in this profession for some of us. And then the lack of training around this, I think, leads to these 4 times more likely to suffer sleep deprivation. We have some of the poorest cardiovascular disease profiles of any profession. 40% of police officers suffer from obesity. There's the prevalence of depression in our profession is nearly double that of the general population. And if you know how hard it is, or understand or agree that it's hard to raise your hand in this profession and say, I'm depressed, that statistic is not valid. I'm guessing it'll be twice that if people were really given permission to raise their hand and say, I need help, I'm depressed. And then it's no wonder that suicide in our profession, we have one of the highest rates. Last year in the United States, we had 159 deaths by suicide of law enforcement officers, reported ones. This year, with our neighboring agencies officer, we're at 147 of reported suicides. We're on track for the 4th year in a row to continue a rise in that number. And these are the reported ones. These numbers don't include those people who medically retire or who retire and commit suicide. Die by suicide. I've really worked on changing my language around this because I believe that when we say commit suicide, we're adding to the negativity of that. And so death by suicide is what I try to say. You know, and so I've mentioned cortisol, and there's a study, and I put this slide in here. My good friend, Chief Bob Johnson from Palo Alto PD, does a lot on the value and the need, the necessity to have at least 7 hours sleep. And it's all based on this cortisol and our circadian system or process. And there's a study, and where it's done fails me, but I'll find it for you later. And the study was of officers on patrol, SWAT officers, and non-sworn civilians. And researchers found that when civilians woke up, their cortisol levels were normal. And at about, I guess it's around 3 a.m. for most people who get a good night's sleep, cortisol starts to arrive. And by 8 a.m., it's present in normal quantities to get you going for the day. With officers, it was twice the normal level. And with SWAT officers, it was 3 times the normal level when they woke up. And this notion that they're on call, this awareness when they're asleep that they're on call is causing the cortisol to continue to produce during their sleep. So it's a really interesting study. They also did a study where they put people to bed and said, we're going to wake you up at, I forget the time, so I'll just say 6 a.m. And at 5 a.m., the cortisol levels started to rise in these people. So they changed it and they said, we're going to wake you up at 4 a.m. And at 3 a.m., the cortisol levels started to rise. So our bodies are really phenomenal machines. And no, our mind is saying, hey, you're going to be waking up early, so get that cortisol going. And it just illustrates 2 things to me, that our awareness of cortisol production, how it happens and when it happens, is super important. And the other thing is the mind-body connection. Really important to incorporate that into our training with first responders. But the science of sleep is fascinating, and there's a new book out by this guy named Walker, a UC Berkeley professor, that really does a lot of great research into the value of sleep and why we should have at least 7 hours of quality sleep. So I'm glad that this is not a recruitment fair, because we wouldn't get anybody signing up for the job. But this is a picture of a young man who joined the force 3 years ago, not my department, another department. And what we don't say to our new recruits when we pin that badge is, congratulations, science informs us. And I think it's the work of the retired New York State trooper, Violante. He's a retired New York State trooper. He has a PhD in, I believe, psychology, but his passion is studying the disease of first responders, and particularly law enforcement. And so what his research concluded was that when you sign up and say, I swear, you are agreeing to take 7 to 10 years off your life expectancy. So, congratulations, young man. You are likely to have some or all of these conditions if you enter into our profession under the current format and content and delivery of training and our culture. Blood pressure, hardening of the arteries, diabetes, immune system inhibition, all of these things, anxiety, depression, addiction, risky behavior. And then on the social behavioral side, police misconduct, incidents of domestic violence, divorce. I would say raise your hand if you're divorced, but I know what the response would be, and I won't put you on the spot. But if you're in police work, the likelihood of divorce being an event in your life is quite strong. And there's cynicism. We see the cynicism set in at about the 5 to 8 year mark. Cynicism and dislike of the people we're serving because the job is not what we thought it was going to be. Nobody told us about all this trauma and stress and how it would affect us. And I don't really know that it's affecting me, but I know I'm not the same person I was when I said, I swear. And then we see this dislike of others turn, and in lots of cases, dislike of self. And this is what we do to our first responders. Difficulty in relationships. So, because we're here to talk about death by suicide, I just wanted to put that chart up there that tells us it is a reality. It is something that we need to pay significant attention to. It's a phenomenon. And I think because it's underreported that these numbers don't tell the whole story. I don't have stats on firefighters, but I know that you're equal, if not really close, to where we are in the statistics around this. And it's interesting, a lot of times when I look back on my brother's suicide, I had a phone call with him about 2 days before he hung himself. And when I reflected back on that phone call, I knew something was wrong. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to educate ourselves, familiarize ourselves with the warning signs. What are the things that could happen when somebody is about to die by suicide? Sometimes we see them get rid of their belongings, passing out things that are important to them, to maybe their children or other people or their coworkers, letting go of things. But I think one of the first signs, is obviously depression. And in our profession, saying I'm depressed is pretty challenging. And it's one of the injuries that's unseen. We can't really see it sometimes. But we can always ask. I think if in our culture we just ask, how are you today? In a sincere way, always ask each other, check it out, check out your neighbor, look to your left, look to your right in your organization, and ask people, how are you doing today? And create a culture of caring. A culture where it's okay to ask that, and it's okay to respond in an authentic way. And I think we can change some of this. I have PTSI up there. I think, a lot of us in this profession, the firefighters, paramedics, emergency room staff, we all have, to some degree, post-traumatic stress. And I can tell you that I'm here as evidence that it's not a death sentence. And I think the more we share our stories about what we are suffering personally or what the impacts have been, we open the door for others to share. And I think one of the other speakers said, in sharing and recognizing our common humanity, there's healing and there's strength and there's opportunity. And so I think we have become a profession and maybe even a society that functions in a constant state of sympathetic dominance. And it's time for us to do something different. So, as a little girl, I thought someday I'd be a cover girl. And it might be fashion, or it might be, for my looks or whatever I was thinking. But, as I saw magazines, I thought, that might be me one day. But it never was until I turned 53, and it wasn't for the reasons that I thought as a little girl. It was because I had survived the trauma and the stress and the PTS, suicidal ideology that I carried with me from this profession, and I sought out a way to turn it around. And so Mindful Magazine profiled my story 3 years ago, and it's in that story that I hope to inspire you to either change your life or that of someone else's. And when I talked about crafting a suit of armor in our culture, this was mine. As an officer, I responded to many, traumatic incidents, and I did a lot of child sexual abuse cases. And there's a lot of trauma if anybody has worked in child sexual abuse for any length of time. It's very challenging. And then I became a sergeant and a lieutenant. By the time I became a lieutenant, I was having chest pains. And about a year and a half into the job, I thought, this is not good. I think maybe I have heart disease or something. So I went to the doctor. The doctor said, you're fine. You're normal. Everything's normal. You're actually really healthy. I'm like, but I'm having these chest pains. Can't tell you. Everything looks fine. And they continued for the next 3 years. And then I became a captain. And things were not quite good in my life. And I wasn't feeling as motivated about my job as I had been. I was always very passionate about being in law enforcement. I have great pride in this profession. And I was losing that. I was becoming a little bit isolated, not really engaged, wasn't engaged at home. I was coming home and I wasn't able to take this armor off. I brought it everywhere with me. I was suffering from a little bit of anxiety. I definitely was self-medicating. That glass of wine when I walked in the door was, God, I thought about it as I was driving home. It got to a point where I walked in the door, my husband, thinking he was doing the right thing, was like, here's your wine, honey, sit down. I was sad a lot. I had 2 children. I felt incompetent as a mother. I felt I was distant from them, although I was heavily engaged. I had a calendar, and I was managing a calendar with a water polo, a swimmer, rugby, all of those theater, everything, all the activities. I had it all dialed in. In fact, if you saw me back then, you would never know something was wrong, because I came to work every day. I put on my uniform, and I did my job. And you would never have known something was horribly wrong. I think this is not unique. I think there are many of us who carry this vest home. And I remember what it was like at the end of the day before I was in this state, and at the end of the day, and you take that vest off and you go, whoa, thank God, especially if it was a hot day. But not taking it off meant that I was protecting myself from the world around me. I was carrying all of this stuff. I didn't know what to do. Certainly wasn't going to raise my hand and say, I need help. And I don't think I realized I need help. I needed help. I wasn't investing in my marriage. I have a wonderful husband who's also in law enforcement, so you can read into that what he was going through maybe at the same time. I was getting sick. I was getting colds. I'm a healthy person. I've never gotten sick. I must have a really strong immune system. But in this phase, I was getting horrible flus. I was just feeling, I'm like, why am I getting sick all the time? I had no explanation. I thought, okay, there's just some bug going around. And so about 6 years ago, as I was a chief, coming to work every day, I was operating on about 4 hours of sleep, 5 hours some nights, with the help of melatonin, taking lots of melatonin to get some sleep so I could get up and function. I was driving to work thinking, most days, I just don't want to be here anymore. What if that big rig just came over into my lane and hit me head on? Those kinds of thoughts were going through my mind. I thought about putting my gun in my mouth. I thought about it so much that I was afraid to wear it most days in case I did it. I was in a really lonely place. But I showed up to work and I did my job, and nobody was any the wiser. And one day, when I was out of melatonin, I happened to go into this health food store. I have 10 minutes, got you. I'm from Ireland, I have the gift of the gab, so I just go on and on. But I was in this health food store, and the person behind the counter came up to me and he said, "What are you looking for?" And I said, "Melatonin." He said, "Why are you taking melatonin?" I didn't realize I'm in a health food store, melatonin. They probably don't sell it because it's not really good for you. And he said, "Why are you taking it?" And I said, "Well, I need it to sleep." So he opened the door and he asked me more questions. And he got me to tell him that I'm a police officer, or as a chief, I'm not sleeping well. And this guy was trained in Eastern Western medicine. And he said, "Have you ever thought about ear acupuncture?" And I said, "No, not likely to ask somebody to stick needles in me." And he said, so he told me some more, and I thought, sounds kind of interesting. And he said, "Think about it. And how about this? Try some meditation to get you to go to sleep. Here's an app that's really good. You'll find a meditation in there for sleep. Try that." So there began my journey, and fast forward, I did do the ear acupuncture, and it really does help with PTSD. I don't know why, it helps. I started listening to meditation apps, and Insight Timer is a free meditation app, and in there is a meditation called Yoga Nidra. And Yoga Nidra is a meditation like a hypnotic sort of quality to it. And once I started listening to that, I was falling asleep. It's sort of like a body scan. So there began my journey into meditation and eventually mindfulness meditation. And mindfulness meditation, we're going to do a little exercise. So if we could just dim the lights a little bit. I'm going to take 2 minutes of your time. And please indulge me, because mindfulness meditation saved my life, as did compassion cultivation training. And in this busy world that we live in, it's very seldom that we take time out for ourselves to quiet the mind. We're lost down the rabbit hole of technology, or we work in stressful environments, or we have families, we're scheduling kids, we have spouses, we have all kinds of things going on. We seldom take time for ourselves to quiet the mind. So just indulge me for a minute. I'm going to give you an example for those of you who don't know what mindfulness meditation is. This is a breath awareness meditation. And it's simply coming down from up here and focusing on the breath. So let's start by lowering your eyes or closing your eyes, whatever is most comfortable for you. Take a moment and feel your feet on the floor or inside your shoe. Just pay attention to that. How the shoe is supporting your foot. Where are your toes? And then move up and feel the support of the chair. Your seat in the chair, the back supporting you. And where are your hands? Notice your hands. Now we're going to take a big breath, a belly breath. We're going to take a big breath, hold it for a count of 3 at the top, and we're going to force it out our mouths. Ready? Get it all out. Empty those lungs. I didn't hear you, but I'm assuming you did that. Let's do it again. Big belly breath. And now go back to the normal breath. Pay attention to where you're aware of it, whether it's in your nostrils, or maybe your chest rising and falling, or your abdomen. And just for a moment, focus on the in and the out. Or you could say silently in your head, in, out, in, out. Now thoughts will come. Maybe what's she going to say next? Or I can hear this or that. Label the thought. It's a voice. It's a sound. And return to the breath. In, out, in, out. Acknowledge the thought and return to your breath. And now we're going to come back into the room, feel your feet again. The seat on the chair, your hands. Open your eyes and come back into the room. That didn't take very long, but what I hope it did for you is bring you down from up here and all the noise and give you a moment to connect with your body. And if we could teach our first responders to do just that after every call or before every briefing or before they go into an important meeting, just that exercise, or merely in the car driving to a call, a big belly breath. That helps regulate the nervous system and helps us stay in that healthy space where we're not over hypervigilance. Because when we're in that heightened state of hypervigilance, our eyesight is compromised. We get tunnel vision. Our ability to recall memory and training is compromised. Our cognitive acuity is compromised. So for officer safety reasons, we ought to be teaching this throughout the day. We ought to infuse our defensive tactics training. All of our perishable skills training should be infused with this kind of practice, this skill building in resiliency. And mindfulness is mainstream. It's everywhere else, and certainly it's in sports. So we are somewhat like athletes. We get up and we do sprints, right? So we want optimal performance, and that's what mindfulness meditation does for us, mindfulness resiliency building. The mind is always, and here are some reasons to meditate, all of this, science informs us that when we meditate, when we build that skill of resiliency through meditation, these are the outcomes for us. Why don't we practice that for our people? So I thought I would bring a little chart in here that's really important because our minds are always at work. And there's a Harvard professor named Killingsworth who did a lot of research around the activity of the mind. And in that research, he determined that about 47% of the time when you're on a task, 47% of the time your mind is wandering on things not related to the task. And there's another component to this called the default mode network and where our mind is. And studies show us that when our mind is wandering, that we're going into a negative bias thinking, that we're often thinking about things that happened in the past, and it was awful, and things that are going to happen in the future, and it will be awful. And in these stories that our mind crafts, there's a person, and it's us. So one of the values of mindfulness is it interrupts this thought pattern. And one of the key things to do that I've learned from mindfulness is thoughts are not facts. The mind is a great storyteller. And the stories are usually about us, and they've got a negative bias. So why continue to craft the stories? If we can develop awareness that, I'm spinning a story, the story is gone. The minute you do that, you don't have to do anything else. It's powerful. And so here's an example of what happens. All of these things are going through our heads. All of these things, all of the time. It's nonstop. And there's a slide on. So compassion. I wanted to spend a minute, because I know I don't have a lot of time, on compassion cultivation. We've included compassion cultivation in our training in the police department, because as we go through life and we encounter people who are having trouble, are having difficulty in life, what do? What are we really good at as friends? It'll be okay. You're going to be fine. You've got lots of self-worth. I have 1 minute. So it's really important for us to do to ourselves what we do to others when they are feeling down. And because of this negative bias of our storytelling, when something is going wrong, we tend to magnify it. But if we could just turn this skill of recognizing the humanity in others and telling people, you're okay, you're just human. If we can do that to ourselves, we can really change the landscape of suffering, because you are worth it. You do have value. And we've got to learn to have compassion for ourselves. And then we build on that in compassion cultivation training and extend it to others. So we start to see the world through the lens of compassion. We see ourselves first and then the world. It's really a game changer for people. So I encourage you to look into that. One of our speakers talked about a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And sometimes we're stuck in this fixed mindset. It's awful. It's never going to change. This is the way it's supposed to be, particularly in this profession. This is how it's supposed to be. I'm supposed to be able to handle these calls for service. I'm supposed to be able to get on with it without changing. We've got to transition to a growth mindset and understand the science informs us. There's this neuroplasticity of the brain that will change if we work on it and we practice these skills. So why not provide our officers with evidence-based human performance training that starts in the academy and continues across every career phase, so when you're tired, scared, or stressed, you still do the right thing. This is a quote from Jonathan Wilder. And you believe in yourself and you value your life. So mindfulness, just the godfather of mindfulness, I'd be remiss if I didn't speak about him. Jon Kabat-Zinn is the person who started mindfulness resiliency training to help people deal with pain and trauma, and that was in the 70s. And so I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Lieutenant Richard Girling, who spoke last year. He is the reason I'm so passionate about mindfulness resiliency training. He crafted curriculum around this, and he created the program where I became a mindfulness first responder coach. But mindfulness is just about being aware of what's happening to you. Where are my emotions? How am I physically reacting to this situation? And just that awareness alone brings us out of automatic pilot and automatic and reaction. It allows us to respond versus react. This is just an illustration of some of the things I have in our department. We have a meditation room, we teach yoga, we use biofeedback devices to help people understand when their heart's racing and their breathing is shallow. Because when they know that that's happening, then these deep breaths help them back into the zone of coherence. And you learn to do that several times throughout your shift. It's very, very healthy. So, creating a resilient you, be a warrior for yourself. Be a warrior for others. Look to your left and look to your right and see, is there somebody? Ask, how are you today? Be a warrior for well-being. Be vulnerable. Tell your story. Let other people see the humanity, the shared humanity of our profession. Be a warrior of change and reverse the stigma around suicide. Be safe, be well, be more. Thank you for your time.
We're all here. Thank you on behalf of the conference committee. Thank you, Chief.
And say thanks to Chief Tejada. I was really impressed, actually, in preparation for the conference here and reading your bio. The depth and breadth of your experience across the various business lines in law enforcement is really impressive. But in particular, for our purposes today at the conference, certainly your ongoing commitment around resilience and wellness, and certainly mindfulness, and now hearing you speak and understanding the personal connections to what you're passionate about and that sort of thing is really very inspirational. I also really appreciated your grounding of your presentation and what you believe in science and evidence and that sort of thing. So I think on behalf of the group here, I just really want to say thank you for coming to us here in Calgary. Thank you for your presentation. And on behalf of the organizers and the Calgary Police Service, I want to present you with a, if I can open it, a coin from the Chief's office.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. I got one back. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I've heard a lot about you. Very impressive.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I think we have one more thing happening here.
Oh.
Where you pick up your papers.
Oh.
So the RSM has brought, you probably saw this before and you probably heard perhaps earlier on the tradition we have. Yes, so we wanted to also make you an honorary Calgarian. I suspect if you would have come to us from Texas, you might already have one of these, but since you're coming from California, you may be one of, even in the size of the state, you may be one of the few people that is an honorary Calgarian. Thank you.
Oh my goodness.
You're very welcome.
I'm really home now.